The camera didn't catch a crime that night. It caught the exact moment a marriage stopped being what one woman believed it was. At 2:17 a.m., the house on Bainbridge Island was silent beneath a thin curtain of Washington rain, the kind that softened the cedar trees and turned the black water of Puget Sound into glass. Sabine Ketteridge sat alone at the kitchen island, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold nearly 20 minutes earlier, while the pale light from her laptop washed across her deep brown skin. On the screen, a security recording played without sound. Timestamp: 2:17 and 43 seconds a.m. A black Bentley eased into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the wet stone before disappearing. Sabine leaned closer. She recognized the car immediately. Rourke's. Her husband of 11 years stepped out wearing the charcoal overcoat she had bought him for their anniversary last winter. For half a second, Sabine almost smiled from habit. Then the passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. Delia Norcross. Sabine knew her face from company dinners, holiday photographs, and the occasional business article Rourke had left open on his tablet. Delia was his director of external strategy. Nothing more, Rourke had always said. Sabine's fingers tightened around the mug. On the recording, Delia said something the camera could not hear. Rourke lowered his head toward her, listening. She reached up and carefully adjusted his collar. Her hand stayed there one heartbeat too long. Sabine stopped the video, rewound it, played it again. The same gesture, the same pause, the same familiar burgundy shade on Delia's lips. 3 hours earlier, Sabine had stood in their bedroom, holding one of Rourke's white shirts beneath the warm morning light. There had been a faint lipstick stain near the collar. Small, almost easy to miss. Rourke had glanced at it and laughed softly. Delia had bumped into him at a crowded company reception, he explained. Probably an accident. And Sabine had believed him. Because trust, after 11 years, was supposed to mean giving someone the benefit of the doubt. If you're listening tonight from somewhere quiet, maybe from your kitchen, your car, or with the lights already turned low, tell me where you are and what brought you to this story. Sometimes we find certain stories at exactly the moment we need them. Sabine pressed play again. Delia stepped back toward the passenger door, but Rourke caught her hand before she could leave. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing needed to. Sabine watched his face instead. She knew that face better than anyone. The softness in his expression did not belong to a business conversation. Delia finally drove away in another waiting car. Rourke remained beneath the porch light, looking toward the dark windows of the house where his wife had been sleeping. Then, before walking inside, he glanced over his shoulder, checking to see whether anyone had seen him. Sabine stared at the frozen image. The lipstick stain had been easy to explain. The camera was harder to lie to. By 7 that morning, Sabine had watched the recording 6 times, and with every replay, the truth became quieter rather than louder. She closed the laptop before Rourke came downstairs, then carried both coffee mugs to the breakfast table as she had done hundreds of mornings before. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, and a ferry moved across Puget Sound in the distance, its lights fading through the gray. Rourke entered wearing a navy sweater and pressed a distracted kiss to her temple before reaching for his coffee. He looked tired, but not guilty. That almost hurt more. Long night? Sabine asked. Denver situation, he said, taking a seat. The team kept me on calls until after midnight. His voice was steady, familiar. The same voice that had once talked her through a delayed flight in Chicago. The same voice that had promised they would always tell each other the difficult things first. Sabine lowered her eyes to the table. 11 years of marriage had trained her to notice details most people would miss. The faint crease between his eyebrows when he was worried. The way he stirred coffee only when distracted. The habit of checking his watch whenever he wanted to leave a conversation without admitting it. That morning, Rourke did all 3. I found something on your shirt, she said carefully. His hand paused near the mug. What kind of something? Lipstick. For one brief second, silence settled between them. Then he smiled. Not nervously, not defensively, almost affectionately. That must have been Delia. The reception was packed last night. She bumped into me near the elevator. He shook his head as though the explanation were too ordinary to deserve another thought. I am surprised you even noticed. Sabine looked at him. She wanted the explanation to be enough. Marriage, she had always believed, was not built by interrogating every strange detail. It was built by choosing trust when suspicion would be easier. So she nodded. Probably nothing. Rourke reached across the table and touched her hand. Exactly. He finished his coffee, collected his briefcase, and left for the ferry terminal 20 minutes later. Sabine stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the wet road. Only after the house became silent again did she return to the kitchen island and reopen the security archive. She had expected one strange night. Instead, she noticed something she had missed before. The system showed 3 saved recordings marked by unusual late-night motion alerts. 3 different dates. 3 nights when Rourke had given her 3 different explanations for coming home late. The first recording was from 6 weeks earlier, on a Thursday night when Rourke had told Sabine that a delayed cargo inspection in Tacoma would keep him away until morning. The timestamp showed 11:48 p.m. His Bentley entered the driveway, remained there for less than 4 minutes, then left again. At first, Sabine saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed the passenger window lower slightly. Delia was inside. The second recording came from 2 weeks later. Rourke had said he was meeting investors in Bellevue. The camera showed his car arriving shortly after midnight, followed by a dark sedan. Delia stepped out of the second vehicle and walked toward him beneath the porch light. They spoke for several minutes. Rourke handed her something small, perhaps a key card or folded note, then watched as she returned to the sedan. Again, nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a single, undeniable moment. But marriage had taught Sabine that meaning often lived in what repeated. 3 dates. 3 explanations. 1 woman. She opened the calendar on her phone and began matching each recording with the messages Rourke had sent her those nights. Running late. Do not wait up. Weather is terrible. Meeting went long. Every sentence had once felt ordinary. Now each one looked carefully placed. Sabine pushed away from the kitchen island and walked toward the living room, where a framed photograph stood on the bookshelf. 11 years earlier, she and Rourke had been standing in front of a narrow brick storefront in Seattle, both younger, exhausted, and laughing. It had been the first office of Vassal Air Systems, before the private terminals, before the magazine covers, before anyone used the word billionaire beside his name. Sabine had designed that office for almost nothing because Rourke could barely afford rent. She remembered painting trim at midnight, sharing takeout on overturned boxes, listening as he described a company that did not exist yet. Back then, everything they owned could fit inside 2 cars. They had not needed much because they believed they were building the future together. Sabine touched the edge of the frame, then let her hand fall. The pain was not that Rourke had become successful. She had celebrated every milestone with him. The pain was realizing that somewhere between those early years and this silent morning, he had learned how to create a second version of his life. One she had never been invited to see. She returned to the laptop and opened the oldest archived folder. There were hundreds of motion alerts. Delivery drivers. Wildlife. Wind moving tree branches across a sensor. Sabine almost closed it. Then one date caught her attention. She had been in Chicago that week for a preservation conference. At 9:36 p.m., while she had been more than 2,000 miles away, Delia Norcross walked alone toward Sabine's front door. Rourke opened it before she could knock. Sabine did not move for several seconds. On the screen, Delia stood beneath the porch light in a cream-colored coat, her hair darkened slightly by the rain, while Rourke held the door open as if he had been expecting her. There was no hesitation, no surprise, no awkward explanation written into his posture. Delia stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. The timestamp continued to run. 9:36 p.m. Sabine remembered that night clearly. She had been in a hotel room overlooking the Chicago River, reviewing notes for a morning panel on historic preservation. Rourke had called at 10:15. He had sounded relaxed. He told her he was home alone, catching up on reports, and that the house felt too quiet without her. Sabine had smiled when he said it. She had told him she missed him too. Now the memory returned with a different weight. She searched the archive until she found the next motion alert from that evening. 11:08 p.m. Delia walked back out. Rourke followed her to the driveway. They stood beside the car for less than a minute before she left. Sabine closed the video. She did not need to imagine what had happened inside. Imagination was exactly what she refused to give this. Facts were enough. She opened a blank document and began typing dates. Chicago Conference. Tacoma Cargo Inspection. Bellevue Investor Dinner. 3 late nights. 3 stories. She added the corresponding camera timestamps beside each one. The list looked almost clinical when it was finished. That helped. Sabine had spent her career restoring old buildings, and restoration had taught her something useful. You did not begin by covering cracks. You documented them. You traced where they started. You learned whether the damage was cosmetic or structural. Only then did you decide what could be saved. By noon, the rain had lifted, leaving the windows streaked with silver. Sabine drove to her studio in Winslow and moved through her meetings with measured calm. She reviewed drawings, approved material samples, and discussed a waterfront rehabilitation project with her team. No one asked if anything was wrong. She gave them no reason to. That evening, Rourke texted that he would be late again. Sabine stared at the message for a long moment before setting her phone face down. She did not confront him. Not yet. Instead, she opened the shared travel calendar, then the household credit card records, then the project folders connected to his company. She was no longer searching for proof of one lie. She was trying to understand how many parts of her life had been arranged around it. The deeper Sabine looked, the less the story resembled a private mistake, and the more it began to look like a decision that had been made around her. She started with the household credit card records. Most charges were ordinary. Ferry tickets, airport parking, business dinners, a hotel in Bellevue that matched one of Rourke's explanations. Then she found a series of payments connected to a development consulting firm she recognized immediately. Norcross Advisory Group, Delia's family company. Sabine stared at the name, then opened the shared project archive she still had access to because Rourke had once asked her to review design feasibility for several Vassal Air Systems properties. One folder stood out. Tacoma Expansion Corridor. Her pulse slowed. Not quickened. Slowed. Sabine clicked through the documents. Site maps appeared first, then zoning studies, then redevelopment estimates. The proposed logistics hub covered almost 12 acres near the waterfront, including a century-old warehouse district that Sabine's studio had spent 2 years trying to preserve. She had presented the restoration plan to neighborhood groups, city planners, and private investors. Rourke knew every detail. He had listened to her talk about those buildings over dinner. He had once driven through Tacoma with her and promised that his company had no interest in acquiring the site. Sabine remembered his exact words. Some places are worth saving. Now his company was preparing to purchase the land through an intermediary. Her hand left the mouse. For several moments, she simply listened to the quiet hum of her studio. Then she opened the archived security footage again. She returned to the recording from the night Delia had visited while Sabine was in Chicago. This time, she watched past Delia's arrival. 43 minutes later, an indoor entry camera captured Rourke crossing the foyer with a document envelope in his hand. Delia followed him. The image was not sharp enough to read the pages, but when Rourke turned toward the light, Sabine saw the corner of a familiar blue cover sheet. Her studio used that color for confidential preservation reports. Sabine opened her project records and compared the dates. 2 days before her Chicago trip, she had printed a private feasibility analysis for the Tacoma warehouses. It included projected renovation costs, structural concerns, ownership complications, and the names of potential investors. Information that could help a competing developer move faster than anyone else. Sabine leaned back in her chair. The betrayal changed shape in that moment. Until then, she had believed she was dealing with a husband who had hidden another woman from her. Painful, yes. Personal, certainly. But this was different. Rourke had not only hidden Delia. He had allowed Delia into the part of Sabine's life she had built with her own name, her own reputation, and years of work that had nothing to do with being married to a billionaire. By late afternoon, Sabine had created 2 folders. One contained the personal timeline. The other contained every document connected to Tacoma. She saved copies to an encrypted drive and removed her studio credentials from every shared corporate portal. When Rourke called at 5:42, she answered on the 3rd ring. "I may be home around 9, he said. "Do not wait for dinner." Sabine looked through the studio windows toward the darkening water beyond Winslow. "I will not," she replied. There was a pause on his end. Perhaps he heard something different in her voice. Perhaps not. Everything all right? Sabine looked at the blue preservation report open on her desk. 11 years ago, she would have answered immediately. That evening, she allowed the silence to remain between them. I am beginning to understand what is, she said. After the call ended, Sabine closed the Tacoma file and slipped the encrypted drive into her coat pocket. The lipstick had wounded her marriage. The documents threatened something Rourke had never had the right to touch. Her work, her name, her trust in her own judgment. And for the first time since opening the security archive, Sabine was no longer asking what Rourke had done. She was deciding what she would do next. By the time Rourke came home, the rain had returned, steady against the windows, soft enough to make the entire house feel sealed away from the rest of the island. Sabine was already at the dining table. 2 plates sat between them. Roasted salmon, green beans, and potatoes with rosemary, the kind of quiet dinner they had eaten on ordinary weeknights for years. Nothing about the room suggested that anything had changed. Rourke loosened his tie as he walked in. You did not have to wait. I know. Sabine lifted her glass of water and took a slow sip. He sat across from her. For a few minutes, they ate in near silence. Rourke talked about a delayed meeting, a shipping problem near Spokane, and a call with investors in California. Sabine listened to every word. She had already seen the calendar. She had already matched the dates. She had already copied the Tacoma documents onto the encrypted drive now resting inside a locked drawer upstairs. Still, she did not interrupt him. That was the strangest part. 11 years earlier, she would have asked questions immediately. She would have believed the answers because belief had once felt like loyalty. Now, every sentence landed differently. Not because she was angry, because she was finally measuring words against facts. Rourke set down his fork. You are quiet tonight. Sabine looked at him. I am listening. Something passed through his expression, subtle and brief. He smiled anyway. That sounds serious. Does it? A little. He reached for his water. Did something happen at the studio? Sabine thought about the Tacoma files. The confidential report. Delia standing inside their home, while Sabine was 2,000 miles away. Something became clearer, she said. Rourke studied her for a moment, but before he could ask more, his phone lit up beside his plate. He glanced down. Sabine did not need to see the name. His thumb moved quickly across the screen before he turned the phone face down. That small movement told her more than another explanation ever could. After dinner, Rourke went to his office to take a call. Sabine carried the plates to the sink, rinsed them, and placed them in the dishwasher. Her hands moved with the calm precision of habit. Then she went upstairs, opened the hall closet, and removed a small leather folder she had not touched in years. Inside were copies of their property records, investment agreements, insurance policies, and the original paperwork from when she had invested nearly all of her savings into Rourke's first company office. She sat on the edge of the bed and read until midnight. Not because she wanted his company. Not because she wanted revenge. She wanted to understand what belonged to her, what had been combined, and what needed to be protected before emotion entered the room. The next morning, Sabine called a family law attorney in Seattle from her studio phone. She did not use Rourke's name at first. She asked about separate property, marital assets, business disclosures, and confidentiality agreements. The attorney listened carefully, then scheduled a private consultation for that afternoon. By 5 o'clock, Sabine understood the next steps. She returned to Bainbridge Island on the ferry beneath a copper-colored sunset, surrounded by commuters scrolling through phones and families carrying grocery bags. No one looking at her would have guessed that she was quietly dismantling the assumptions of an 11-year marriage. When she reached home, Rourke was not there. Sabine walked into his closet, found the white shirt she had noticed days earlier, and removed it from the dry cleaning bag. The stain was almost gone now, reduced to the faintest trace near the collar. She folded the shirt carefully and placed it inside a box beside the encrypted drive. Then she printed one document, a formal notice prepared by her attorney. She did not sign it yet. She set it on the desk and stood at the window, watching the lights of Seattle shimmer across the water. Sabine had spent years believing strength meant holding a life together. That night, she understood something else. Sometimes strength was knowing exactly when to stop pretending it was still whole. Sabine waited 3 more days before she spoke. Not because she was uncertain, and not because she hoped Rourke would suddenly confess. She waited because she wanted every decision to belong to her before the conversation began. On Friday evening, the house was unusually still. The rain had finally cleared, leaving the air cold and clean, and the distant lights across Puget Sound looked sharper than they had all week. Rourke came home just after 8. He found Sabine in the living room beside the fireplace, a small box resting on the coffee table. "You are home early," he said. "So are you." He stopped, noticing the box. Sabine gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit down." The softness disappeared from his expression. For the first time, he looked cautious. "What is this about?" Sabine waited until he sat. Then she opened the box and placed 3 things on the table between them. The white shirt, the encrypted drive, the formal notice from her attorney, now signed. Rourke looked at the shirt first. His eyes moved to the drive, then to the document. Silence settled over the room. "Sabine, you already know what is on it." He looked up. "On what?" "The drive." His jaw tightened slightly. "I do not." Sabine held his gaze. She did not raise her voice. "Then we can begin with 2:17 in the morning." The color changed in his face. "Barely, but enough." Sabine continued. "Or we can begin with Chicago. Delia came here while I was away. Or Tacoma. Or the preservation report that left my studio and ended up inside your development files." Rourke stood. "You went through company records? Records I had authorized access to." "That is not what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean." The room grew quiet again. Rourke turned toward the windows, one hand resting on his hip. "The Tacoma project is complicated." "No, it is documented. You are connecting things that are not connected." Sabine looked at him with an almost painful calm. "That was the mistake I kept making. I kept separating everything. The late nights, the messages, Delia, the files, your promises. Once I stopped separating them, the picture became very simple." Rourke turned back. "Nothing happened the way you think." Sabine almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I am not interested in the version that helps you sleep." That sentence landed harder than anger would have. Rourke sat again. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then his voice softened. "What do you want?" Sabine looked down at the signed notice. "I want my studio protected. I want every document related to my preservation work removed from Vacillaire Systems. I want a full disclosure of any financial interest connected to the Tacoma site. And I want the separation handled privately and professionally." His eyes narrowed. "Separation? Yes. You are ending 11 years over this." Sabine looked at the shirt on the table. The stain was nearly invisible now. "No. I am ending 11 years because I finally understand what I was being asked to ignore." Rourke said nothing. Sabine rose, walked to the entryway, and picked up the single suitcase she had packed that afternoon. She had already rented a small furnished apartment in Tacoma, less than 2 miles from the warehouse district she had been fighting to save. Rourke followed her to the door. "Sabine, wait." She paused, but did not turn around. "There are things we can fix." Her hand rested on the doorknob. Buildings can be restored when the structure is honest about where it failed. Then she looked back at him. "People have to be honest first." Sabine stepped outside into the cold evening air and closed the door gently behind her. No shouting followed. No dramatic collapse. Only silence. By the time she reached the ferry terminal, the lights of the house were disappearing behind the trees. Sabine did not look back again. For the first time in days, she was not searching for evidence. She was moving toward a life that did not require any. Sabine's new apartment in Tacoma overlooked a narrow stretch of Commencement Bay, modest compared with the house on Bainbridge Island, but entirely hers. For the first few weeks, she lived among rolled drawings, borrowed furniture, and cardboard boxes she never seemed to finish unpacking. Then the work began. She met with neighborhood business owners, preservation advocates, structural engineers, and investors who still believed the warehouse district had value beyond demolition. Some meetings lasted 10 minutes. Others lasted 3 hours. Sabine kept showing up. By spring, her proposal had changed from a preservation argument into a complete redevelopment plan. The old brick warehouses would become offices, studios, small retail spaces, and public waterfront access, preserving the original structures while creating enough revenue to make the project viable. 18 months after she left Bainbridge Island, Sabine walked into a Tacoma planning hearing carrying a leather portfolio and nothing else. Rourke was already there. Vassal Air Systems occupied one side of the room with attorneys, consultants, and development executives. Sabine's coalition occupied the other. Their eyes met only once. Rourke looked older. Not dramatically. Just enough for her to notice that confidence no longer sat on him as effortlessly as it once had. Delia was nowhere in the room. Sabine later learned that she had left the company months earlier after the board began reviewing several undisclosed consulting relationships connected to the Tacoma expansion. Sabine did not ask for details. She had stopped needing them. When her turn came, she stood before the planning commission and spoke for 22 minutes. No anger. No mention of marriage. No mention of betrayal. She talked about tax revenue, construction costs, historic credits, local jobs, public access, and long-term property value. She answered every question without looking at Rourke. By the end of the hearing, the contrast was impossible to miss. Vassal Air Systems wanted the land cleared for efficiency. Sabine had found a way to make preservation more profitable than destruction. 3 weeks later, the city approved her coalition's redevelopment plan. The news reached her while she was standing inside Warehouse 4, sunlight cutting through dusty windows and landing across the original Douglas fir beams overhead. Her project manager read the decision aloud from his phone. Everyone around Sabine began celebrating, but she remained still for a moment, looking up at the century-old structure. She thought about how easily people confuse strength with replacement. Tear something down. Start again. Build newer. Build bigger. But some things did not need to disappear to become valuable again. They needed care, truth, and the courage to rebuild around what was still sound. Across town, Rourke received the same decision in a conference room overlooking the waterfront. For the first time in years, he had lost something money could not simply recover. And the woman he had once underestimated had defeated his plan without humiliating him, exposing him publicly, or asking anyone to choose sides. She had done something far more difficult. She had built the better future. 2 years after Sabine left Bainbridge Island, the first restored building opened on a clear October afternoon. The old warehouse no longer looked abandoned. Sunlight poured through tall industrial windows, warming the original brick walls and polished timber floors. Small businesses occupied the ground level. Architecture studios and design firms filled the upper floors. Outside, families walked along the new public waterfront path, while ferries moved across Commencement Bay in the distance. Sabine stood near the entrance, speaking with one of the local owners, when she saw Rourke approaching. He came alone. No assistants. No attorneys. No company car waiting at the curb. He stopped several feet away and looked around the building before meeting her eyes. "You saved it," he said. Sabine glanced toward the exposed beams overhead. "A lot of people did." Rourke nodded. The old certainty in his voice was gone. What remained sounded quieter, more human. "I should have listened to you." Sabine said nothing. He continued. "About the project. About Delia. About all of it." The name no longer carried the power it once had. Sabine had heard months earlier that Delia moved to another firm in California after leaving Vassal Air Systems. That chapter had closed without Sabine needing to witness it. Rourke looked toward the windows. "I spent a long time trying to convince myself that I had only made a few bad decisions." He paused. "But that was easier than admitting I became someone you could not trust." Sabine watched him carefully. There was no satisfaction in seeing regret settle across his face. Only recognition. "I am sorry," he said. "Not because the project failed. Not because the board questioned me. I am sorry because you gave me the truth for 11 years, and I answered it with secrecy." Sabine let the silence remain between them. Then she nodded once. "I believe you are sorry." Hope flickered briefly in his expression. "Does that mean there is any chance for us?" Sabine looked past him toward the waterfront, where the afternoon light stretched gold across the bay. "Forgiveness is not the same thing as returning." Rourke lowered his eyes. This time, he did not argue. After he left, Sabine walked upstairs to her new office. On the desk sat the encrypted drive she had kept since the night everything changed. She connected it to her laptop and opened the old security folder one final time. There was Rourke beneath the porch light. There was Delia. There was the timestamp that had once divided Sabine's life into before and after. She watched for only a few seconds. Then she closed the file and deleted the archive. Not because the past had become untrue, because it no longer needed to be carried. Sabine shut the laptop and walked toward the windows. Below her, lights began appearing one by one across the restored buildings. For years, she had believed rebuilding meant recovering what had been lost. Now she understood. Sometimes rebuilding meant creating something that had never existed before, something stronger because it no longer depended on being believed by anyone but yourself. Sabine could forgive Rourke without returning to the life that had taught her to doubt herself, and that quiet choice may have been the hardest part of all. If you were standing where she stood, facing someone who truly regretted betraying your trust, would you open the door again, or would you protect the life you rebuilt without them? If this question stayed with you, share what you think in the comments.